Hello, young people of the internet. Welcome back to another episode of Bright and Early from the Bill of Rights Institute. My name is Rachel Davison Humphreys, and I'm here with my colleagues, Kirk and Gary.
Hello.
Hey.
So as we're finishing up another week in quarantine land, formerly known as the United States, we wanted to check in with you all, give you some things to think about as we're thinking about things. So guys, how are you doing this week? How's the week wrapping up for you?
It's going pretty well. I'm finding myself on Zoom or on teleconferencing quite a bit. I'm getting used to it, and I'm spending a lot of time thinking about next week and the week after that and the week after that. How about you all?
The week after that?
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think I have now spent more cumulative time in front of my computer than ever in my life, which has been an interesting adjustment. I think adjusting to the way that we have conversations, the way that we're talking through and working on projects together has changed, and I think it's really hitting me this week that it's a lot of technology interfacing.
Right, and I think that's something. Again, this week, because I think the frenzy is over a little bit, like the kind of we're settling into that this is the pattern of our work and school life. So I had class last night for 3 hours after work, right? So we're just that this is how we're going to be interacting. And that got us thinking, just as a group and independently, about kind of the history of technology and innovation and America, and kind of situating us in the moment. Kirk, I know you've been thinking about the history of this because that's what you are wont to do.
Yeah, it is what I am of wont to do at times. But I do think it's interesting that we've lived through, we collectively, both you students and us, the three of us sitting here, through a period of very great economic and technological change. I think even 5 years ago, Uber, which is a word that's used as a verb now, wasn't even as big of a thing, nearly as big of a thing as it is now, which is an incredible thing. Maybe 5 years is generous, but certainly 10 years ago, it wasn't. And so that's just one example of many examples of how our changing is interface. And thinking about us being on Zoom had me thinking about how this technology and the efficiency with which we're able to interact with one another has really shaped how it is we're experiencing this pandemic and this isolation. And I think that that's going to lead to a lot of changes in education. And I immediately, of course, am wanting to connect that to a previous period where there was a lot of rapid economic and technological change that then led to change in education, which was really at the turn of the 19th and the 20th century. Thinking about there's lots of new technologies emerging or being really maximized at that point. So you're thinking about train travel. So travel becomes much more instantaneous. Factories are continuing to grow. You have the Taylorism movement, sort of the perfecting of that manufacturing style. People really fine-tuning the division of labor within factories. All kinds of things come out from that. But one of the things that grows out from that is that education shifted to better serve the needs of that world, right? So moving from older models of education to more of, I think, what we recognize now with grading, like a graded system, a grade that you are in. Those were all things that were created and implemented, many of them at the turn of the century, which I think it's interesting because we're out now all seeing what may be another evolution of education. As you students are experiencing firsthand, there's some bumps that come along with that. There's probably some good moments and probably some frustrating moments, and probably a lot of learning moments that come whether directly from what you're learning from your teachers, but you're really learning alongside your teachers at this point too, which is interesting.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we're noticing with that is this kind of the energy that comes from transitioning fades a little bit, but we still need to be really active in continuing to make sure that these learning experiences are as robust as they could be. Right. And so one of the ways that we do that is we continue to project and think about, okay, well, this class was like this, but what is the next class like? and like, what is the assessment going to look like? Or how can I do a project like this, right? And so we're constantly future oriented and future thinking. And I know Gary has been thinking a little bit about how people in the past thought about the future, especially of education.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of what Kirk was saying it was similar to what I've been thinking of as well. I also want to put on my historian hat. As a history teacher, my last unit was always on history of the future, because once you've been teaching or are around enough, you start seeing that history class is just everything up to that point. That point is a moving point. And so there's a lot of value to looking to the future, to understand where you are now and possibly where you're going. And it generates an interesting thing about purpose, right? And the purpose of education itself, because so often you look at school as this is the way it is because that's the way it is. But it turns out it's not always been a certain way. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, there's a reason why we do things in the same way right now. There's going to be a reason why school is going to look a little different now. Many of you right now may have already started or are going to start online classes, doing things virtually. And as Kirk said, it's going to take some learning from everybody. We are all now on the same page about learning these things. And there's some good and some bad, but ultimately it's different. And ultimately it asks that question, what is the purpose of the things that we do? So you're right. I was looking at some ideas of futurists of the past. Kirk mentioned that it was at the turn of the 20th century that a lot of this thought was happening, possibly because of the Industrial Revolution, the idea of factories, new ways of doing things. So I dug up some old postcards that were made. These postcards were from around 1899 to 1901. This particular collection was actually in the possession of a very famous futurist of the past, who is no longer with us, someone named Isaac Asimov. And I have actually been starting to go back and reread some of his Foundation series. If you want to learn about school and the future, it is great. It's a shockingly good series, particularly if you like robot stuff. Anyway, that's for another time. That's for a future occasion. But here's an example. This is an artist. This postcard is from around 1901, so right around that turn of the century, by Jean-Marc Cote. And if you can see that, and I'll open to the two of you, this is from 1901 about what the year 2000 would be like. Do you see anything unusual or familiar or anything strike you about this one?
Well, I mean, it looks a little bit like cell phones or FaceTime or Zoom being used, right? There are more wires than we need now, but it's a similar concept.
Yeah, absolutely. At a time when the idea of, I mean, there's no television in 1901. So the idea that you could project images and talk to someone far away is a pretty remarkable idea. We haven't even gotten into the fact that they just, yeah.
There is one major difference though, and that's that these lovely people are sitting at a restaurant outside together. And that's,
right.
that's
true.
Different than the now. That's different.
Or it's kind of curbside seeming. I mean, I see their plane parked right there. So maybe the restaurant is bringing out to the curb. But you're right. They do seem closer than 6 feet apart to each other. Good thing they're utilizing the good thing they're utilizing the technology to talk to the other people there.
It's true.
Yeah. But again, speaking to the idea of education and the thought, here's another one. This one's actually from a little earlier. This is from 1828. Oh, goodness, I went really fast. And this was called The March of Intellect by William Heath. And it's a little hard to see in here, but that change that Kirk was talking about, this is a satirical take about the technology of education. A little hard to see. I recommend looking it up. But what that is actually a university. And the idea of the satire is if the university is becoming this, for lack of a better word, factory, what impact is that going to have on society? And as you can tell, this artist is saying, maybe not a great one, but no matter what, a change that is going to happen. And the last one I just wanted to show, which is really great, is again, thinking about your experience as a student right now, and the idea of what the future of school is going to look like, is this other one from the original author, Jean-Marc Cote. This one's from 1899, and it's at school. You can see a teacher to the right here, kind of inputting books into a machine that is being transmitted to students somewhere. What do you all think of this one?
Yeah, very internet-esque, right? You know, maybe not, maybe a more physical representation than we would see, but I think the idea of knowledge transference through some kind of, you know, electronic medium isn't too crazy. And I think what's interesting about this one, and what's interesting about the first image you showed, is the strands of technology that they're pulling on. Particularly, you know, in 1901, you know, phones would have been fairly new. Airplanes weren't even really a thing yet. And so the things that they're finding to really create these images, I think, are just really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Pulling on what you know, but leaving it open to a future to say what is possible, what is probable, what is likely, and what's maybe preferable too. Like what would be good for the future. And so that's a great point, Kirk, because that leads me to a question I have for you, the students out there. You know, I always like to ask you to observe what's going on and maybe journal it and think, all right, what is the purpose of education, right? Assuming there is a value to it, which we think there is, when you boil all of it down, what is your experience of what education needs to be? Does there have to be interaction with other people? I mean, you mentioned transfer of knowledge, right? There should be some gaining of knowledge, but these are leading questions. What do you think the purpose of education is? And then what fulfills that purpose? So for example, does bringing people together online at the same time, is that helping to fulfill it? Are certain assignments fulfilling it in a certain way? Are you pursuing your own learning and education? And I would love for you to be a futurist of yourself. Even right now, even in the short term, what do you think, based on the way things have been going and your experience with the past couple of weeks or even the past couple of years in school, based on innovation and all these trends, what do you think education is going to look like in September or a year from now or 10 years from now? Or you could be futurist like the turn of the century and say 100 years from now, how will education and those purposes still happen? And the fun thing is, you're not only as much of an expert of the future as anybody else, because none of us have experienced it yet, but being a young student, you have a lot of input into making that future happen. So we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Right. And I think that's one of those huge opportunities that exist right now, right? That's why this is a really exciting time for education. You've seen a very rapid transition to platforms that not a lot of people were ready to use, to pedagogy, so theories of learning and how we teach, that not a lot of teachers were ready to really rise to use yet. I think the teachers are all doing their very best, and I hope that you all are seeing that out there, that this is, a lot of your teachers not only are working to help support you, but then they also have their own children at home, right? And so and they also may have other responsibilities. And so this is a lot of work to transition in this new technology, or to this new technology this rapidly, right? So in the history of, so as you know, all histories have subfields. One of the subfields of history is the history of education, and a subfield of the history of education is the history of educational technology. And so how the technology of society influences how we do education. So the purpose of education has always been an interesting question, right? So Gary touched on that, and that's actually something that people have thought about for a really long time. There's a book called The Republic that was written by Plato, which is all about the purpose of education. And so this is not an easy question that he asked you to journal about. So know that many different groups have thought about this a lot, and whether, and the other thing is that there's a lot of conflict between the multiple purposes, right? There's a professional purpose and a civic purpose and a like a growth purpose, and there are all these things that influence how we make choices about our education and what we find value in. And what I love so much about those prompts is for you to ask that question to yourself, right? you are at some stage in your education and you're being given an opportunity to say, what is important to me? What is this all for? And then ask, how do I make it more for that? What do I do? So for instance, every technology that has permeated society has found its way into our educational environments, right? Whether that was the first chalkboard, which was lauded as being the most transformative technology that has ever existed. It wasn't, because more technologies came, but at the time it was this incredible technology. Or maybe it's books, or maybe it's a projector. Can you imagine when you couldn't project things in a classroom? Gary,
Still do sometimes.
What is that, Gary?
This is my projector. Sometimes, just for fun, I like to catch up on old reels.
There you
Still
go.
works.
And that was in your classroom, right? Like that was a technology that was no longer being used.
That was what was available. Yes.
Exactly, but no longer being used. And so like in the 60s, the whiteboard, the computer, and then as we go into today, we have all of these technologies of the e-learning technologies and the OER, like so many online resources that you can have access to. The LMS, which we all like, whether it's Blackboard or Canvas or Moodle that you're working on, we're all beholden to this platform now, right? That didn't exist. And so one of the things that I think is interesting is to think about not only our own learning and what's happening right now, but also kind of where we're positioned in the history of education technology. So I've been thinking about this for a while now, for a couple of years. I'm finishing up a master's in education and technology. And if you're interested, you can scan this QR code and it'll take you to a VR app that will let you explore the history of education technology. And just know that you aren't, like, everyone's going through this together right now. And I imagine that you're not only seeing your teacher struggle and your classmates struggle in different ways, but you're struggling in different ways. That's also natural when a new technology comes on, because you don't have habits built up for how to structure your day or your own learning, right? So I like to think about, whenever I think about the fact that I'm struggling with someone, I like to find friends in that struggle. And if you're not familiar with Onfim of Novgorod in the 13th century, Onfem was a young man in the 13th century who was assigned some grammar assignments on birch bark, and he proceeded to become distracted as he was doing those and doodle all over them. One of which is a doodle where he shows himself killing a guy on a horse and saying, "I am Onfem." And that's how we know that his name is Onfem. So as you're thinking about your own experience, I take solace often in knowing that everyone has their own journey and their own struggles. Even Onfem in the 13th century was struggling with his focus at a time when he was being asked to do things that were new for him. And so as Gary mentioned, we've been thinking about how to teach better for a long time. Kirk mentions we've been thinking about how to be better for a long time. Every new technology requires us to rethink how we engage with one another. And I mean, the founding itself was a technology and governance, right? A new technology and the idea of a democratic republic. That required some transitions in society and required people to continue to be future thinking. Gary mentioned, but there's actually, stop sharing my screen. Gary mentioned that there's actually a term for this called a futurist. One of my professors, his name is Bryan, is a futurist. I know, Gary, you had a professor who was a futurist when you were in your graduate work.
Yes, yes. W. Warren Wagar, look him up. He unfortunately also passed away, but wonderful books on it.
Yeah, and so futurists are professionally people who think about what the future may hold. Bryan is actually an educational futurist, so it's been really interesting to see his take on what's happening. And one of the places, as Gary mentioned, that we can go to start to think about what the now means for our own education, but also what it could mean in the future, is to the kind of fiction and sci-fi especially world. So if you haven't read a book called Ready Player One, Gary and I have both read it, and it imagines a future where all students are online in a virtual reality all the time, and what that means for their own education. But it's not actually only about education, it's about friendship and about what it means to be yourself. It's a fun book. I really enjoy it. Don't watch the movie. The movie's not great. The book is very, very good. But there may be other books out there that you know of. I know the Divergent series has this theme. A lot of Gary's images reminded me of Brave New World, the opening sequences in Brave New World where they're educating the children. There's also a book called The Fourth R, or you have Le Guin or Heinlein or Ender's Game. Kirk, I know you really like Ender's Game. But there are a lot of places you can go to help you not only escape a little bit the present, but to be that future-oriented thinker. Because everything that's happening right now requires us to conceive of a better future and to act towards that better future. And whether that's supporting your teachers or supporting your classmates or supporting the people in your other communities, our biggest task is to be future oriented, I think. And so that's what we've been thinking about when it comes to the technology.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, right? I think because tying to the major questions that you put out there for us, Rachel, it's not just, it's thinking about how things are going to be changing, because change of one type or another is inevitable. But it's also keeping in mind those foundational questions of what are we trying to accomplish here? So as we're seeing in classrooms across the country grappling with these big questions and trying to get on with going through the educational process, what are we trying to accomplish, and how can that be assisted by new technology? And also, what are some of the challenges that new technology can pose to sort of those foundational things? I think that it's really exciting that students have an opportunity to be going through this moment, as unfortunate as it is, but the voice that you all have to shape where things go from here because of the experience that you're living in right now, I think it's really profound. And is a real opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about the future too in terms of, it isn't set. There's lots of different ways. For the most part, a lot of stuff's going to stick around, as you've seen through time, but there's a lot that changes as well. And I agree with you. I think it's interesting as a student to think about the future in kind of two different ways and how you could be part of it. One of them is, what is the possible future and what is possibly going to happen? But then there's what's a preferable future? What's a better way? And you can nudge or move just a little bit things toward that preferable is really powerful, as you were saying. And so with interesting times come interesting opportunities. And I think that's really good to remember right now.
Yeah,
absolutely. And so, as always, we really want to hear from you. What are you reading? What are you thinking about the future? What are you thinking about the now? How has technology changed your habits and how you're working with your classmates? How has the right now changed how you're thinking about history and how you're thinking about the future? We'd love to hear from you on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and here on YouTube. So on that note, thank you all so much for your time. We are always so glad to talk to you, and we really enjoy these conversations. So thank you, Kirk. Thank you, Gary.
Sure. We'll see you in the future.
We'll see you in the future. Take care. Be well.
Thanks.
See ya.
Bye.